Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Seberg. I'm the Assistant Director for the Medical Cannabis Research Center at Drexel University. Happy today to have our panel of guests today to talk about the Black history of cannabis. This has really come about through a lot of conversations with our community advisory board, wanting to make sure that we're really giving a voice to the legacy market in terms of how it's evolved, but also how people who are historically marginalized by cannabis prohibition, people who are disproportionately targeted by cannabis prohibition, how they have used it historically and how it's all came about through society. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Tauhid to give an introduction of our panel today.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for having us and for hosting this wonderful, very important conversation. Happy Black History Month, y'all. It's a fun month. It's a fun month. So I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. I'm going to give a very brief intro to our panelists, and then I'll let our panelists talk a little bit about themselves too before we get into the actual questions. And for moderation purposes, if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we will leave some time at the very end to do some Q&As. So I'll start with my introduction. My name is Tauhid Chappelle, pronouns he, him. I wear a lot of hats, but in terms of this conversation, I am a medical marijuana patient. I've been a medical marijuana patient since 2012. I am the founder of the Philadelphia Cannabis Business Association based in Philadelphia. I've organized 2 cannabis conferences, the Color of Cannabis Conference and the Can-Atlantic Conference, to talk about the impending legalization of cannabis on the East Coast and specifically the Mid-Atlantic region. And also, I'm also a cannabis journalist who has written and covered various cannabis equity issues, particularly on the East Coast. And so my background is in media. I've worked in TV for 4 years. I've worked for the Washington Post and the Philadelphia Inquirer. And currently I work for a media policy organization called Free Press to change the narratives around crime, police, and the criminal legal system. We have a stellar lineup of speakers today. I'm very honored to be in this virtual space with them. I'm going to give a very brief overview of who they are, and then again, I'm going to let the panelists give a little bit more background history of who they are as well. We have Dewey Thomas, who is the Director of Education for the Diasporic Alliance of Cannabis Opportunities, aka DACO. We have Professor Linn Washington Jr., who is a professor at the professor of journalism at Temple University, focusing on race-based inequities. Specifically, has a course related to cannabis, which I'm super excited to talk to him about. And then we have Jelani Gibson, who is a reporter for NJ Cannabis Insider, which is part of NJ.com and the Star Ledger. So I'm going to start with Dewey Thomas. Just Dewey, do you mind giving people just a little bit more background of who you are and who DACO is?
Sure. Well, thank you, Tauhid, and thank you, Drexel, for this forum, because it's very important that we start to discuss cannabis on a deeper level within our community, in terms of historical accuracy and facts about the plant and how to interface with the plant safely. 2018, we started DACO. It was the brainchild of my wife, Sharon Perry Thomas, and we saw a need to educate our community about the coming cannabis or THC economy and where do we fit in. And I'll just work backwards from there. Our core focus and our economic interest from day to day, we sell supplements to health food stores. And then we saw the advent of CBD and all of its potential. But then taking a deeper dive, we said we have a social responsibility to really speak up to our community about this wonderful plant. And everybody has a history. This plant has a history. And we also have a historical connection. So 2018, we started DACO. 2018, I became a patient And I'm just working my history backwards. And then we're going to just keep going back. 2016, our children were studying in Amsterdam. And I went over there and I went into a coffee shop and used cannabis for the first time in 27 years. So I'm a young person, I will call, of the crack era. That was a very dramatic era for young Black men. And in 1989, I stopped using cannabis and all substances because we were at war and it was a question of survival. Do you want to become a functioning adult in this society or get mowed over? Like so many Americans in this society, I was introduced to this plant 1974 in junior high, which is not a good thing, and which I wouldn't advise to anybody. So that's why we need to have these adult, family, village conversations about this plant. This plant is good for food, clothing, shelter, sacrament, fuel. This is a prehistoric plant that we co-evolved with as human beings and nature. So could we have made it without these plants, where our brains have matured, where we would have had the wherewithal to jettison around this whole planet? And we look at this plant, the recorded history of it goes back into Chinese medicine. And the reason it starts in Chinese medicine because their herbal medicine dialogues were uninterrupted. So you see, thousands of years ago, the Chinese, they started talking about the role of cannabis and how it helps so many ailments. I'm just going to do just a quick come up to where we need to be as African people. And then you see the Vedic texts in India. They talk about the role of cannabis. And in China, it was a tea culture where they drank cannabis. In India, it was more of a culture of mixing it with other herbs and drinking it, and a drink they call bang. And then you see evidence in Kemet or early Egypt, where you see cannabis being used as salves. And then you're starting to see cannabis being smoked. Since I've been educating people on cannabis with DACO, I've read everything I could get my hands on. I've gone through the internet. I've read all the books, the popular books of today. But what we lack in a lot of ways is real hard archaeological facts around cannabis, specifically in terms of Africa, because there are a lot of holes where you see cannabis in the Nile Valley, and you don't see connections for thousands of years. But then you see the evidence of the first water pipe or bong developed in Ethiopia. One real good reference is a gentleman by the name of Chris Duvall. He wrote a book, The African Roots of Marijuana. And he has a theory. He calls it the two-strain theory, indica and sativa. And we're not going to hold fast with that, but just for purposes, indica and sativa. And we're going to look at this more like geography. The sativa is more toward the northern hemisphere, the long stalk growing hemp. These plants were traditionally used more for making of ropes, for food, clothing, that type of use. And in the southern hemisphere, more of an indica, it was more medical, as people were using it as a medicine. So within that, you have the contact or the collision between the people of the Northern Hemisphere and the people of the Southern Hemisphere. The people of the Northern Hemisphere used this plant essentially to invade the Southern Hemisphere and take over the Western Hemisphere. So how did they do this? They controlled the supply chain and logistics. So all of the sea-bearing boats in the age of colonization, all of those sails and all that rope, the hundreds of tons to launch those endeavors, that was all done with hemp for the most part. A little bit of flax and some other fibers. For the most part, that is hemp. And that's how we come about with the whole transatlantic slave trade, is because the people of the Northern Hemisphere had a logistical advantage because they knew the power of hemp. Hemp was like the computer chip or oil now. Who controlled that? Controlled the world. So in addition to that, they mastered the art of killing people from afar. Primitive guns to cannons. People of the Southern Hemisphere had nothing to answer that. And they looked down, aside of enslaving and colonizing the people of the South, they were a little miffed with their relationship to the plant. Historically speaking, African people are a smoking culture, for better or for worse. You can go throughout the African continent and see all types of pipes and pipe culture and smoking culture, from the what you would call the showcase societies of Kemet, Egypt, beautiful pyramids, onto the Twa, the small people that live in the forests, misnomer the pygmies. All of these people, they had their little stash and they were smoking people. And they looked at, that's a waste of hemp. So here we have this clash of cultures. You have the annexation of the West. So you can imagine the tall ships come over. The indigenous people say, what is this? These big tall ships have come to port. But it was with the use of hemp that they were able to essentially take over that Western Hemisphere. So not only the sails on the boats, but you look at the covered wagons, those canvas covered wagons, that's what hemp is, canvas. They were able to transport a 2,000 pound payload west. So the indigenous people, they didn't even have a chance. But you can put cannons in those wagons. You can put lots of people and they didn't get wet and they just kept moving west. So here are some of the early roots in history. And when you look at hemp, the hemp trade itself, that was the hardest work to do on the plantation. There's a lot of documentation supporting that. And we look at yesterday, the big football game. It took men of that stature. A man of my stature couldn't work the hemp fields because that was hard work. So it had to be the biggest, strongest men on the plantation. They did the hemp work. And hemp was the connector because we were in a cotton economy. What were bags made? The bags were made of hemp. What were all the ropes and the pylons, all those things in between? It was all made of hemp. So what happened to the enslaved women? Well, they became the breeding class in states like Kentucky because that was a hemp state. And the progeny was sold down the river. So you can see our people are very intimately connected with this plant. And leaving out of America and looking at colonized Africa, and I'm going to wrap up with this, and then we can go back and forth. But I think this is very, very important. Looking at colonized Africa in the late 19th century, that's when cannabis became first outlawed. Because they say, these people, they smoke this stuff and they're not moving fast enough. What is wrong with them? We need to make this illegal. So you've had hundreds of years of a society being interrupted. So what is the epidemic health of this? After you have people that have been enslaved and essentially worked to death on the continent, and their only solace is to have a little bit of smoke at the end of the day after they're carrying heavy loads for the colonizers as they get better and better at chopping up Africa into their own domain. So it's a very tragic story once you really start to read into it and dig into it. You had essentially our ancestors living on the peripheral of genocide, and the only solace they could have in the Congo from Leopold's reigns, chopping off limbs because people weren't getting the rubber out the trees fast enough. You had these smoking societies, and that's where people came together, specifically in the evening, played their drums and smoked. And that's how they relieved the situation that was going on around them. And you see a direct through line from the cultures of Southern and Central Africa on through to America, to Jamaica, and the Rastafarian culture. So none of this is foreign to us. But what is I would say oppressive is that we have been laid false since day one, just by being human, just by trying to meet our own medical needs. So in Africa, that's where cannabis was made illegal at first. However, not in India. India had a very vibrant cannabis economy. The reason it wasn't outlawed in India, because they were able to effectively tax it. They had control of it. India being colonized after Africa, they set up an administrative state. So they had very effective taxation. That's why when they had the conference on drugs, India went under the radar because this is part of their culture. No, this is a part of the culture of what is called the crown, is being able to squeeze every drop out of everything. And that means taxing people's medicine. And I can go on and on. There's some figures within Philadelphia and the Americas, men that did well with this plan, aside of all the oppressive situations that we come through. So when we talk about cannabis and equity and all those things, the transatlantic slave trade couldn't have happened without hemp. And that's period, full point blank. And you can see RT that, because that's a reality.
Appreciate it, Dewey. Thank you so much for the intro. Thank you so much for the historical analysis, especially about the ancient history. And for those that are listening or going to watch after this, to add a little bit of context, that there is no difference between cannabis and hemp. The only legal difference is the THC percentage that is found in hemp. They are literally the same plant. So Dewey talked a little bit about the ancient origins of cannabis, and I put some links to talk about the ancient origins of cannabis in India, China, and a really great book about the African roots of cannabis. So, you know, with the transitioning of cannabis into the New World in America, cannabis would obviously become introduced to America and grow in various shapes or forms and be used by various people. Professor Washington, Linn, can you talk a little bit about your background as a professor, your understanding of cannabis history, and really talk a little bit about kind of the history of cannabis leading up to the Marijuana Tax Act and really before the start of the war on drugs and into the war on drugs. What can you talk about the history of cannabis in America here?
Okay, hi, my name is Linn Washington. I teach in the journalism department at Temple University. Of relevance to this conversation, I've been writing about and researching matters related to cannabis, marijuana, weed, since the mid-'70s. It's funny that Dewey would mention his first introduction with cannabis in junior high school. That's where it started for me. I read a book called, actually two books. One, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and the other was Man, Child, and the Promised Land. They both talked about the use of this stuff, and it was like, whoa, what is this, right? And then, so from then on, I had some interest in it. Dewey also was talking about the Africa connection to cannabis, and one of the things that we've seen, particularly in terms of regulation and, shall we say, enforcement and punishment here in the United States, is some very clear racial disparities. And while we talk about the United States, let's roll it back a little bit. The first international laws that were approved to outlaw the use of cannabis, one of the countries that was at the forefront of that was South Africa, then under British colonial rule. Now we think of South Africa and apartheid and they blame it on the Dutch, true, but the Dutch only codified what the racism that was already in place by the British. So, let's try to keep that in perspective. I've looked at marijuana not only in the United States, but also in various parts of Europe, Paris, London, Amsterdam. I've also been down in South Africa where I studied it. And in South Africa, going back thousands of years, marijuana was used both for medical purposes and for euphoric purposes. And it's a funny thing about the medical use of cannabis. A English scientist who was assigned to the British East India Company in India, when he was there, he studied it and studied its use, brought it back and started making medical compounds out of cannabis. And it became a really important medical substance, so much so that there was a firm that operated in the old city section of Philadelphia in the late 1800s, and they were making cannabis tinctures and other compounds, and they were advertising it, and one of the advertisements went into a newspaper called the Christian Recorder, which was the official newspaper of the AME Church. So if it was so bad, why would it be in a church magazine? What became bad is when there was efforts to try to demonize certain people. The first laws outlawing drug use in America targeted the Chinese. Their smoking of opium. Ironically, at that same time, you could literally buy liquid opium compounds from their drugstores. Now, let's be clear, it wasn't CVS or Rite Aid, but you could go into a pharmacy in those days and get it right off the shelf. The largest users of liquid cocaine at the time, liquid opium rather, was amputees from the Civil War and white women. But there was an effort to try to demonize and otherwise target Chinese, and thus it became illegal. If we flash forward a couple of decades, when the effort was made to demonize Mexican immigrants in the early 30s, around the time there was a economic upheaval and those people were taking our jobs, they started targeting smoking of marijuana. So I know I'm coming forward and going back, but marijuana has been studied extensively. In the late 1800s, the British government went into India and did an extensive study. They interviewed over 1,000 people. This report was 30 more than 3,000 pages long, and they came to the conclusion that moderate use of marijuana was no problem. It didn't cause people to go crazy, but that particular study seems to be just put on the shelf and is collecting dust. The United States government in, I think it was the 1920s, the U.S. Army did a study on the use of marijuana in the Panama Canal Zone because they were afraid that, soldiers were smoking so much weed they wouldn't be able to shoot a gun. They found out that it wasn't no big deal. But there was an effort in the United States. In fact, the precursor of the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, they were trying to find something else to do after the end of Prohibition. And the guy who ran it was a guy named Harry Anslinger, a bigot to the bone. Let me be clear on that. And he started targeting marijuana, and thus you started getting this, this reefer madness. Marijuana is going to cause, you to go mad. One of the big fears was that marijuana would be used by white women, and they would have sexual intercourse with Black men. And Anslinger used that line in part to get the matter outlawed. And that would have been in 1937. And when I say outlawed, it is legal under federal law, but you have to get a $1 federal tax stamp that they don't give out. So if you could get that tax stamp, you could be legal under the federal regime, but you can't get that stamp. In the late 30s into the early 40s, in New York City, Anslinger had demonized the use of marijuana, and it was supposedly centered exclusively in Harlem, where those people lived. And the mayor of the city initiated a study. He got the New York Society of Medicine, okay, not the Manhattan Marijuana Users Association, but the august New York Medical Society to do a study on it. They did an extensive study, and some of the findings were that marijuana did not cause juvenile delinquency, marijuana did not cause crime, marijuana did not lead to hard drug use, which is what we still hear. Last year when the legislature in Delaware finally approved adult use of marijuana, and I draw that distinction between adult use and recreational use. Recreational use, to me, seems to still demean it, where it's adult use. I'm an adult, should be able to do what I want. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm paying taxes. Leave me alone. You want bourbon? You want your buds wet? Some people want their buds dry. But the governor of Delaware vetoed that legislation because he said that marijuana, in his opinion, leads to hard drug use, and we don't need any more drug addicted people. Right. Tell your state police and your county police to stop arresting people for marijuana and start focusing in on people who are selling fentanyl and heroin. So we've had all of these studies. Now, let me try to just focus it in on Pennsylvania. You would, given the fact that marijuana is only available through a medical regimen in Pennsylvania and not legalized for adult use, let's roll it back. In the early 70s, the then governor of the state, Milton Schaap, instituted a study through his governor's commission on alcohol and drug use. They came to the conclusion that marijuana should be decriminalized. What they found out that there was a disproportionate enforcement. Blacks were being targeted. They also found out that police were cracking down more on the use of marijuana than they were on the use of heroin and other hard drugs. There was legislation proposed, and this is in the mid-70s. The Philadelphia Inquirer came out with a editorial saying pot isn't a social menace. Yes, the Inquirer was behind it. But the legislation went nowhere. It at least two co-sponsors for the legislation. One was a legislator from Pittsburgh, a guy named Joe Rhodes, who went to my high school. He graduated from my high school and went to Caltech. He's a brilliant guy. I was in class with his youngest brother. And one of the other co-sponsors was a Philadelphia legislator named John White Jr. They couldn't get any traction. They held hearings around the state. They had the support of the Pennsylvania Bar Association, the Pennsylvania Medical Association. They got the tacit support of the Pennsylvania Prosecutors Association, but the legislature wouldn't move on it. There was another Pennsylvanian involved in efforts on a national level, Richard Nixon, who launched the war on weed in a very with very racist and oppressive intents. There was a commission called the Schaefer Commission, and it was named after Raymond Schaefer, who had been a former federal prosecutor and a former governor of Pennsylvania. And in what would have been 1972, they came to the conclusion to decriminalize it. When Schaefer gave the report to Nixon, you could hear it in the Nixon tapes. Nixon got it. He was so pissed off, he threw it in the trash can. So the evidence has been there that it's not been problematic, but the powers that be continue to hold it as such. In the early 80s, there was a Philadelphia state senator, a guy named Milton Street, whose brother went on to become mayor, and his grandson is now the senator from North Philadelphia, who ironically, or should I say interestingly, is at the forefront of efforts to legalize the use of marijuana. Milton Street called for marijuana to be legalized and taxed, not because he wanted to smoke weed. He felt that taxing it would help reduce the tax burden, the property tax burden on people in his district. When you look at the projections that he made on the revenue that the state could generate through taxation in 1983, his numbers were not too far off from what the Pennsylvania's, the Auditor General did a couple of years ago. So we have known what is right, we just haven't implemented it. Has marijuana been used? Absolutely. Does it get abused sometimes? Absolutely, but it's been used quite a bit. In the 70s, there were the Philadelphia Tribune, the African-American owned and orientated newspaper in the United States, in Philadelphia, every now and then would do polls, just went around people and asked, do you support this? Do you like this? Do you like that? And every time they would do one on marijuana, people would say, hey, we like it, don't make it illegal, leave it alone. What we've seen throughout the illegalization, I hope that is a word, if not, I've just made one up, we see a disproportionate enforcement on African Americans. When you look at the LaGuardia report, that was the report that was done by the New York Medical Society on behalf of the mayor of the city, who was Fioria LaGuardia. When you got to the crime portion of it, you saw that the number of people who were arrested, African Americans, outstripped anybody else. Police were targeting them. When you looked at the Governor Schaap's report, you saw the same thing. Before Philadelphia decriminalized marijuana in 2015, between 2008 and 2014, under the administration of an African-American mayor named Michael Nutter, 27,141 people were arrested, and they were Black. And during that time period, only 5,574 whites were arrested. So clearly there was a racial impact on the enforcement. Fortunately, people who are arrested do not end up in jail to a large degree, but what they do end up with is a criminal record, or should I say an arrest record, and that arrest record precludes them from getting apartments, jobs, bank loans, federal student loans. If you've had any kind of drug arrest, you're barred from getting federal education loans. However, if you're, say, a bank robber, you could get that after you served your time. And I'm not just saying this, academically, but I am saying it somewhat anecdotally, because I had a a student in a class one year who had did a 5-year bid for bank robbery, and he wanted to get a business degree, and he was in college on a student loan. But somebody who gets caught with just, one stick of marijuana can't get that loan. So we need to do something different, and it's good now that the media is taking a different kind of approach to marijuana, because at one point the media was a serious propaganda vehicle. One of the things that I showed to my students is that there was an article in the Los Angeles Times in, I think, 1901, and the exact same language was used in the Washington Post in 1910. And one of the lines was that marijuana smoking made people wilder than the wildest beast. And if you see some of these articles that were in newspapers all across the country, including Black-owned newspapers, you see a demonization of marijuana. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Washington. And this is a great segue. Speaking of the media really trying to, or rather acknowledging the impact and the influence that the media has had on not just populations, but lawmakers, which has turned into what we've now seen as war or tough on crime, tough on drug laws and rhetoric. We know that the media has really played a role in influencing and reshaping how we see marijuana being a dangerous narcotic and cannabis being a healthy, safe medicine, despite them being the same plant. So the media does have a very, very influential role in shaping the narrative and the conversations around what we believe to be, what we believe to be safe or dangerous when it comes to cannabis. And so, speaking of journalists, I would like to segue into Jelani Gibson to give a little bit of background history of who he is as a Black journalist. And to know Jelani was the first Black reporter in a newspaper covering cannabis in the entire country for the United States. And I believe you are also NJ.com's first Black marijuana reporter in its history as well. So you bring a lot to the table, and your involvement in the ongoing legalization of New Jersey will play and has played a pivotal role and key role in influencing Pennsylvania and how Pennsylvania talks about potential legalization, especially around the conversations of criminal justice, racial justice, reform, and equity as well. So Jelani, can you give a little bit of background information of who you are and what you've experienced covering the ongoing legalization of this plant?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I don't ever think I've heard anybody hype me up like that, so I don't know what to say. But yeah, I mean, there were definitely other like cannabis reporters, but I would say I'm probably the first Black one for like a mainstream outlet, so to speak. Me, I'm born and raised in DC. My introduction to cannabis was when I was in elementary school. I used to pick up weed from my grandmother all the time. And so, weed in our household was never considered to be like this bad drug. Like weed was medicine to my grandmother. And so in the same way that I would pick up cigarettes and alcohol from my grandmother at the liquor store from my uncles, I would also pick up weed from the local weed man for my grandmother as well. And so, I remember I hit my grandmother up one day and I was like, weed is legal. And she just looked at me and said, so what? It's always been illegal in our household. So said it was always legal in our household until the police came around. And so, I mean, for me, I guess you could say we just grew up in like a very cannabis friendly family. We also did have our fair share of alleged crack dealers in the family as well, and robbers. But usually when your family's involved in selling crack, you don't really look at weed as like a serious drug, so to speak. Because in the streets, weed money is slow money, and crack money is a lot more quicker, so to speak. And I think that's one of like the largest misconceptions of like the drug game overall is like everybody thinks that like people who sell weed are like these big kingpins. And I would say, like, compared to everybody who's moving crack, heroin, or even fentanyl, like the weed man is like the working class of the drug game, so to speak. You know, you got people who sell weed who, you know, probably making, you know, anywhere from 40 to, you know, 70K a year, you know, stuff like that, regular working class salary, just so happens to be tax free. And so and so, you know, that dollar is going to go a lot more further. But you know, my background is I was a photojournalist in the Air Force for a bit. Then I was an education reporter. I've covered schools, I've covered K through 12, I've covered community colleges, I've covered academia. So that also means I kind of cover you know, in the words of my old editor, he said that there's nothing more slimier than the backside of a 4-year university. And you know, that may have been very cynical for him to say, but I've covered my fair share of things in academia that are related to drug policy, that are related to the school to prison pipeline. I've covered my fair share of things in academia that relate to the caste system of academia that they have, you know, with your lecturers and your adjuncts, you know, professors living homeless just like their students. So I've covered those issues. I've covered, you know, who gets the grants, whose department doesn't get the grants, politics of the faculty senate and the staff senate, and how that influences not only the type of studies that universities do, but the type of studies that get done about cannabis in general, the type of studies that get pushed out by the university about cannabis, the type of studies that get the university press release, and the type of studies that don't get the university press release and pushed out to the media. So I have that perspective, and before you, as you know, I was a gun violence reporter at the Kansas City Star, and I covered police gun violence and police union corruption before I came here. So I think that's pretty much just catching you up on everything. The reason why I'm actually in my car right now is because I'm outside of City Hall. I got to go here at like 6 p.m. And the reason being is because of the way that cannabis is currently playing out. You know, I heard a lot of interesting stuff about history, and I think that history is being made right now. And I think right now the popular narrative that's being said is New Jersey is supposedly a national model of sorts. But I say this all the time, and I say it from an education reporter perspective, that if every other state has gotten like an F, and then you come through with a grade that's slightly higher than that, technically speaking, it is the best ever. But we need to put what the best ever is in the proper context of how much money we've put toward the war on drugs. And we are not putting as much energy into helping Black and Hispanic people out as we put into the war on drugs. And so it's my job as a reporter to give that context, to understand that the $10 million that the New Jersey Economic Development Authority gave is definitely much needed help, but it pales in comparison to the roughly 1.2 billion per year that the 250 million or 200 million, I believe it's 200 million over in New York is a lot of money, but that 200 million is for the entire state. And the majority of that money hasn't been raised yet. And, you know, 200 million compared to the more than 10 billion that people spend on the NYPD every year. If you do those numbers, you're looking at anywhere from less than 2 to 4% of what we invest into the war on drugs on a yearly basis. And so when people say national model or this is more than ever, what we have to realize is that more than ever has traditionally been zero. And so it's pretty easy to make something more than ever when the ever has been nothing. And so, you know, what I do as a reporter is I simply compare the amount of resources that are going into the war on drugs, and then I compare the amount of resources that we're putting, you know, into fixing it, so to speak. Thank you, Martha.
Amazing. One of the ongoing conversations, knowing the history of marijuana legalization and the war on drugs, is that we know that Black people have been disproportionately impacted, and the ongoing conversations that we continuously hear across the country are, social equity, or even reparations when it comes to legalizing this plant. This is a question for all three of you to answer. So I'll open the space for any of you to answer. What does equity mean in terms of cannabis legalization? How would you define it? And what do you think would get us there to where we feel like Black communities have actually been reconciled and supported through ongoing cannabis legalization? So I'll open that up to the panelists.
I'll take that real quick because I'm gonna have to go in about like 12 minutes. But I've said this, and you've heard me say this like multiple times before. The people who have been disproportionately screwed over must be disproportionately helped out. Like it's just that simple. And we tend to want to make it rocket science, but it's not rocket science so much as it is simply a matter of willpower, so to speak. And so, take about the simple fact that roughly 70% of the municipalities opted out. But the war on drugs didn't take place in 30% of New Jersey's municipalities. The war on drugs took place in 100% of New Jersey's municipalities. It didn't take place in 30, 40, or 50% of Pennsylvania's municipalities. It didn't take place in 20 to 30% of Philadelphia. It took place in every municipality, in every county, in every country, with every municipal police department, with every county law enforcement, with every school resource officer, with every counselor, so to speak. And so, now when you get these opt-outs, what we're essentially doing is we're seeing almost like a refugee like situation here in New Jersey, and it's very similar to what I saw with the opt-out when it came to what the Supreme Court did with abortion. They didn't ban abortion outright. They told people that they could opt out of abortion, and so that caused a lot of women to go to other states whose systems were already stretched for that specific type of healthcare, and it overburdened those systems. That's what opt-outs do. Some people stay in, some people stay out, but then the people that are not allowed to participate, they end up essentially migrating to the places where that care is still rendered. And so what you have now is a form of cannabis, what I call cannabis refugees in New Jersey. If 70% of the municipalities are opted out, if you're a municipality that's opted in, so if your municipality that's opted in, but you're surrounded by 5 municipalities that are opted out, well, that's not fair to you as a municipality, because that means that not only are you having to heal the harm from the war on drugs from the people in your own backyard, but now you have to make it right for other people that are coming from other municipalities' backyards. And we oftentimes say, oh, well, cannabis legalization isn't right for every community. Well, if disproportionately locking Black and Hispanic people up was right for every community, then making it right needs to be right for every community. And I don't feel uncomfortable saying that as a reporter. And if that is certainly the case, then just from a devil's advocate standpoint, let's say, okay, cannabis legalization isn't for your community. Then at that point, you have to come up with some alternative form or method to make it right to that population, and say, if we're going to opt out of this, we still shouldn't be allowed to opt out of making it right to the specific people that we've screwed over in our backyard. And so, since 70% of the municipalities have essentially opted out, it's causing that 70% to essentially compete in the adjoining 30% of municipalities, which is essentially creating an environment that's not only unfair for the municipalities, but also unfair for the applicants. It's very important to know that in New Jersey and in any cannabis legalization scheme, it's not just the Cannabis Regulatory Commission that I keep an eye on. It's the Cannabis Regulatory Commission, the municipalities, the governor's office, and the legislature.
Thank you, Jelani. Yeah. Professor Washington or Dewey, any thoughts?
I just have a little anecdote regarding reparations. I think a very constructive argument can be made for reparations around reefer. when you look at the arguments against reparations, is saying that there's nobody today living who were slaves. Well, there are people living today who have been adversely impacted and really ravaged by marijuana laws. So I think a very cogent legal argument can be constructed for that. But the little antidote, this has been in the back of my mind for a while, and I want to do an article on reparations and reefer. So I figured I would try it out when I was a keynote address, when I made a keynote address to a reparations organization. And so when I finally got around to putting this idea out, it was like I passed gas in a church, loudly and malodorously. It was like, whoa, how dare you say that? Put those two words together. So we might be a little ahead of our time in bringing the war on weed into the reparations argument, but it can definitely work because you could see a straight through line from the federal action in 1937 all the way up to today. And when I look at the stats in Philadelphia, even with decriminalization, African Americans are still the disproportionately impacted. In fact, the police department has created some new laws that they now enforce. One is called, I think it's called having marijuana or something like that. I mean, they've created some new stuff to keep arresting people and keep arresting them disproportionately. So I think that needs to be looked at a little more. But there's still that stigmatization with marijuana. I mean, when somebody says, I use marijuana, then, the response may be, oh, you're smoking dope. No, we're not smoking dope. We're smoking marijuana. There's a difference. We're using marijuana. There's a difference. I remember having a conversation with some people who are from the Netherlands. And, we were in this ski lodge in northern New Hampshire, and we're talking about their country and marijuana. And they're sitting there with cigars, big, fat, stinky cigars. And I don't mean to insult anybody who smokes cigars, and drinking bourbon. And they're saying just how bad and devilish marijuana is. And I'm like, well, you're smoking cigars and drinking bourbon. So why can't somebody go to a coffee shop in your attractive town of Amsterdam and enjoy it?
I want to be sensitive to time. We have about 5 minutes left, and thank you to our esteemed panelists for so much wisdom. I know there was a lot of history that was dumped on everybody, but I'm hoping that it gives you some perspective when it comes to the conversations, especially at the intersection of Black communities and cannabis history. So we'll open it up for like 1 or 2 questions from the audience.
If I could make a
go for it,
closing comment on the last one. What we're in now, I call it the cannabis bubble, because we have no federal mandate. So rules today are not going to be the rules for tomorrow. What's imperative to our community, no one's going to give us anything. They haven't given us anything so far, and if they give you something, there's strings attached. It's about business and economic development, as well as educating our community from seed to final sale, whether it's hemp milk or whether it's some CBD rub-on or whether it's some medical marijuana or whatever. We have to learn the business. There's more of us globally than it is small-minded people in America. So we have to really think internationally with this. And we have to use this plant safely, because I see the weaponization of cannabis coming. Nowhere in the annals of history have people taken on this much THC. We have to be very clear on what's going on. And in the words of Sonia Sanchez, is this freeing us? It's about holistic, economic, as well as healthy development of our community to heal as a planet. It's not about the greed, it's about the need to de-traumatize this planet. Because the one thing about this plant and the way it's produced, it is just piling on in terms of sucking resources out of this planet. So we have a lot of work to do with this. And, you know, we at DACO are in here for the long haul, and I really respect what Drexel's going to do. I know I'm pinging on time, but
Thank you, Dewey. I appreciate it. We'll take questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question for our panelist?
I actually have one for you, Tauhid.
Go for it.
Certainly, with a lot of the conversation, a lot of the expertise on the panel being in journalism, how can we hold news outlets accountable? How can we advocate for better education and more accurate conversations surrounding cannabis, both the benefits, the harms, and generational trauma, and kind of how it all works together? I saw an article or an op-ed from Kat Packer talking about the importance of how we talk about cannabis instead of using black market term, using legacy market, other market. How can we, anyone who's listening to this, be better advocates in helping people understand what cannabis really is?
Jelani, would you like to take that before you got to go?
Yeah, this will be my last thing, and then I really do got to log off. But yeah, I mean, basically, you know, you're going to need. I think that the conversation starts, quite frankly, with more reporters of color coming on to the cannabis beat. I was actually pretty surprised that, you know, I've done like a lot of beats in journalism throughout my life, and this is actually like the cannabis beat was like one of the whitest beats that I've been on during my time as a reporter, which kind of took me aback, so to speak. And so I think that more people who understand cannabis and who understand the culture, you know, would help. I mean, just as like a weird aside, like I got drug tested in order to get this job. Like, like I literally had to, like the corporate company put me through a piss test in order to, you know, in order to be a drug reporter, you know, so that just like, it's like that just lets you know how like far we still have to go. And I don't know whether or not they were like testing for cannabis, but it just threw me for a loop. And so yeah, I think that more representation works, and then also understanding that how we've described cannabis is also, and Tauhid has talked about this, and he can talk about it more after I dip, but how we talk about cannabis has also been rooted in how we report on crime in general. And it is rooted in what we call the crime beat in journalism, and that beat in and of itself, how we report on policing, how we report on crime, is directly correlated to how we report on cannabis and how we report on the health welfare of other residents. And so it was cool talking to y'all. Tauhid, you already know where to reach me. I'll catch y'all later.
Thank you, Jelani. Professor Washington, you know, you've been a Black journalist for many decades. What about you? How do you think that we can hold our industry accountable?
Well, I would just follow up on what Jelani was saying, that there needs to be more diversity, or should we say more diverse voices in the coverage. But the industry itself has to recognize, one, its responsibility to provide information to the public, but also that watchdog role to make sure that government works in the best interests of the people. So given that, irrespective of feelings about marijuana, the fact is that the enforcement has been racially discriminatory, and now the rollout of the legalized industry, there's clear racial disparities there, from the types of money that is required just to make an application. And there's a lot of talk, and there was a lot of talk in New Jersey about trying to do something for the legacy industry, but that really has been more rhetoric than not. So the news industry has to stand up to other industries, but in standing up, they're just standing up and doing what they're supposed to do anyway, and they don't do it and have not been doing consistently.
Thank you, Professor. Anybody else? Any other questions? I recognize it is 6:02. I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. So I guess Jim, if it's okay, we'll take one last question. If there is one more question from the audience. All right, hearing none, Jim, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Tauhid, and thank you, Linn and Dewey, and of course, Jelani as well. This has been a great conversation, kind of talking about how history is really kind of played out and kind of the importance of social equity as we look to move forward. I think the conversation around reparations is certainly something that the industry as a whole will need to reckon with at some point. And certainly understanding how we allocate those tax dollars as well too is another interesting thing on our end that we've seen at Drexel. On our website, we have a couple of articles, article summaries on one, a student and professor did a look at how mental health care in this country could be supported by investing tax dollars from cannabis revenue and kind of different things like that. So certainly want to continue that conversation moving forward about how we can best allocate tax dollars, how we can best research cannabis, how we can best talk about cannabis, and making it a better understood, more well understood, founded in fact and science, and not through kind of fear mongering or any sort of misinformation. So definitely want to make sure that that is part of our mission moving forward. I did want to also drop into the chat here our next month's speaker series with Peter Tahara and Jeff Raber. They are both from California. They've been working in the both the medical and adult use industry, kind of talking about the lessons learned from legalization, that switch, that transition from medical to adult use. They are very big advocates for incorporating the legacy market into the legal, regulated, and taxed market, helping people find testing solutions, making sure the products are safe and tested. So I'll drop that in the chat. You can also find that on our website, should be posted in the next day or two to RSVP to that. Moving forward, so thank you everyone for coming to the speaker series. Thanks again to our panelists. Thank you again to Tauhid for moderating. We look to see you all, it'd be March 21st for our next speaker series.
Great.